I'm showing people around and they come in the front door, I usually try to get a little information from them as to know what they are interested in looking at and what their interests are and what their background is, because then I can sort of change the tour around to meet their qualifications. Okay. Now, the two things I try to stay away from is politics and religion. So now I think we'll start on our tour, and as I usually have the people come in here, and the very first thing I do is I have them stand right here and look at our Fresnel lens here. Now what I do is I have everybody stand back about where the camera is, and I point at this and I tell them this is a Fresnel lens and it came out of a lighthouse, and the little kids, I always have them guess how big they think the light bulb is that's inside of there. And then I come up and I open up the door and they can look in and see it's only about this size. Now, if they're interested in trivia, I'll say, okay, if you want to stump your friends, which state in the United States had more lighthouses when they were in use of any other state? And, oh, we have Oregon, Washington, California, so on and so forth. Turns out it's Michigan. And around the Great Lakes, they had more lighthouses than any other state in the United States. Okay. Down towards San Diego, there's a place called Dana Point. And that is named after Richard Dana, and he wrote this book here. It's called 2 Years Before the Mast. And it's about his trip on that boat. He worked as a common sailor. He came around from Boston, and he came around the tip of South America up here to California, collected cowhides and tallow from the local ranchers, and this is the ship. Now this model here, there is a full-size replica of the Pilgrim and at Dana Point, and you can go aboard and learn all about his sailing and everything. Now here is a picture of the Pilgrim under sail. So now the way the name of the book came about is that the entire trip took 2 years, and it's 2 years before the mast, because in front of the forward mast, down below decks, is where the ordinary sailors stayed. And so he spent 2 years before the mast. All the officers and everything were in the stern of the ship, and all the rest of it was used up with cargo. So this was a cargo ship. Cut. Okay, this is a model of the Amerigo Vespucci, and this ship is in existence today. It is a training ship for the Italian Navy. It's like our United States Navy, or United States Coast Guard, has the Eagle, which is also a sailing ship and a training ship for Coast Guard personnel. Now, this ship here is called Amerigo Vespucci, and there's a long story that goes along with Amerigo Vespucci, because he was a cryptographer, and he was the guy that America was named after. And his friend, a German cryptographer, was making maps of the whole world, and he knew what to call everything in Europe, but he didn't know what to call the New World, and so he called it Amerigo, because Amerigo was writing like travelogues and stuff, trying to get people to take trips to America. So along here we have what we call our Dutch masters, starting with that painting right over there on the corner, going to the left here. These are Dutch and German paintings, And the Dutch and the Germans were known for detail work. If you look clear in the very background, somebody is a half inch, an inch tall. He all has ears, nose, mouth, mustaches. And on this particular painting here, what we did is we took different areas and we photographed them, and we blew the photographs up and put them on this thing here so you can see all the details of all the people in the paintings. Now, I'm not going to go through all of these paintings with you, but there are some that are quite dramatic. This is the Sovereign of the Seas, and it was built by a model builder named Ed Marple. And we'll be looking at his stuff very shortly. It's behind here, and his workshop is back there, so we'll be talking in detail about his models and stuff. But the reason that this is setting here is because this is an English ship, and over here we have the painting of the same ship. Now, this ship here, when I was taking my training, I was told the guy sitting on the horseback here, he was the first king of all of England. And that's what I've been telling people as they came through. And here, a couple of years ago, there was a gentleman in the group that, unbeknownst to me, had a little bit more knowledge than I did. And he says, "That's King Edgar." I says, "King Edgar? Who in the heck is that? I thought that was King Arthur." He says, No. That's fiction, okay? And he says, "That's King Edgar sitting there on the horse. And he was the first king of all of England before the Normans came in." I said, "Boy, you must really be a history buff to know that." He says, "I teach history at Cambridge." So I said, "That's King Edgar. Did you know that?" Now, something he did tell me, though, is that all the bumps that you see underneath the horse, now this is strictly symbolic, though. Those are all the heads of the other kings, and symbolically, he is riding over the top of all the other kings. Now, there's all kinds of questions that I get from model builders and stuff like that, and the people that are really interested in ships and sailing and that type of thing, why certain things are built the way they are. You can't, if you get out here in front, this thing sticking out the front here is called a bowsprit. And if you look down in the center here, it's off-center. And people have asked me, well, why isn't it centered up? Well, the reason why is because it has a long distance that is sticking out here, and it needs support inside the hull to keep it steady. Now, it has to move over to miss the mast, and that's the reason it's stepped over to one side and it's not directly in the center. So that's what that is. Now, over here we have a painting. Now, forget about the bar down the middle. It has nothing to do with this. There's something wrong with this painting. This painting is that particular ship. And there's something wrong with this painting that absolutely cannot happen. But back in the old days, an artist was hired to tell a story, and he did not let the truth get in the way of a good story. If the wind is blowing like this to fill the sails, which way should the flags be blowing? This way. And another thing is, if the wind is blowing like this so the ship can sail, how come this one's going that way and this one's going that way? Now, in this painting here, he's got ships sailing in all directions. So, now throughout our museum, we have other things that are wrong with paintings that I'll point out to you in the future when we get to them. Now, this ship here is a Dutch ship, and it has these dagger boards hanging over the side. And there's one on each side, And the reason for those is because when most of these ships sail up and down rivers in Holland, they have sandbars and stuff in the bottom of the river. And if it had a keel, it would get stuck on the sandbar. With these, they just flip up and the thing keeps sailing on. Now there's one on each side because the way the wind is blowing, if the ship heels over to one side or the other, they put one of them down and pull the other one up and vice versa. Now this ship over here is a Swedish ship, and its whole claim to fame is when it sailed the first time with a bunch of people on board, it tipped over on its maiden voyage. And a lot of the people drowned. It laid on the bottom. It is a Swedish ship. It laid on the bottom for 300 years, and the Swedish government raised it, and because the water was so cold, it was almost in perfect condition. And they put it in a warehouse, dried it out very, very slowly, and today that warehouse has been turned into a museum. And it's in Stockholm, Sweden, and the roof only comes up to here, and the masts actually stick out of the top of the roof. Now, we have a ship model club person that he was having a very hard time for trying to explain to the people a scale of a ship model. And like, is this one actually bigger than this one? And so on and so forth. What scale are they built at? So he tried and tried to explain it to people. Finally he came up with an idea, and on this ship here he has a little man carved to the exact same scale as the model. And that little man is 5 foot 6 inches tall. And so as we go through the museum, you'll see that little man, he's been carving little men at the exact same scale as the ship and putting them on those ships. Now the reason that this ship turned over is the King of Sweden wanted a ship that had more cannons on it than anybody else. And just before it was finished construction, they found out that there was another king that had a ship with more cannons on it. So he says, I don't care what you do, I want more cannons. And they had to put another cannon deck on it, which made it top heavy, and when the wind hit it, over it went. Now this is the only pirate ship that we have in our museum. And remember I was telling you about the guy building little people 5 foot 6 inches tall? Well, that does not go along with this particular model, because those people were already on the ship when we got it. So I have no idea what the actual scale of this ship is. But this ship here comes from the same area that we're having trouble with pirates today. They're taking over tankers and stuff like that, and so, but it's the same area that we're having trouble with them today. So this ship here is a Dutch cargo ship, and if you notice, the mast is stepped way back in the middle of the ship. And the reason it does that is because down on deck there's a grating, and that grating comes off, and that's where the cargo is. And this thing sticking across here is called a yardarm, and it's for holding the sail and stuff. But when they're loading and unloading this ship, they use it as a crane, and they have a block and tackle tied onto it. They turn it around, they drop the hook down into the cargo, and they load a bunch of cargo, they lift it out, then they swing the yardarm around and dump it on the dock. So that's what that is used for. And it's a very shallow drafted ship, so it can sail up and down the rivers. This particular ship here is a French ship. Now, when you talk about the French coastline, it seems like everybody always thinks of Normandy, the invasion, and stuff like that. Well, that's on the Atlantic. A great deal of the French coastline is in the Mediterranean Sea. And that's where this ship here was used, and it was used for dignitary purposes. The people rowing this ship were not slaves. They were French Navy personnel. And they were used, this ship was used for knighting princes and making admirals and stuff like that. Now, when it was not being used for that type of work, it was being used for to go after pirates and control smuggling, because it is an armed vessel. Down here in the front, down here, there's a bunch of cannons down here sticking out, and it was an armed vessel, and that's what they used it for when it was not being used for dignitary stuff. Okay, this is Marple's workshop. Now, nobody ever works here because of the sawdust and everything. It would have to all be vented. But this workshop here was in his house. Now, up there on the wall there, it shows this desk and so on and so forth in his house. Now, he was a dental technician. He was not a dentist. Dental technician, makes crowns and bridges and things like that, and is familiar with doing very detailed work. That's the reason that he worked very well with our ship models and stuff. He not only built the ships the way the real ships were built, he also did all of his own wood carving and so on and so forth. So anyway, he made his own cannons with a duplicator machine. Now, if you look over there in the corner, you'll see a Cannon duplicator machine. Now, we couldn't find his. There's a picture of it up there on the wall, but I brought in my duplicator so that we can have a duplicator for people to see what it does. It's like a key-making machine. There's a pattern that the little part rubs up against, and then the long part goes in and cuts the wood. The first two ship models Marple built after he retired is the first two up in front here, and those are kit models. They were purchased from a store. Now, he did modify them to put on more detail than actually the kits had. Now, each one of these models here, in his case, they all have a little man standing there somewhere on deck, and it's a 5 6 inch man to give you an idea of how large the men are in comparison to the ship. And the one on the far side is even smaller than this one. Now, this first ship here is a Charles Morgan, and it is in Mystic, Connecticut. Yet today, it is the only remaining whaling ship in the United States. Now, the boats and everything he made, and so on and so forth. The one on the far side there is a cargo ship and transportation ship. Starting with the third one, he started building them the way the real ship was built. He laid the keel, made the wooden frames, put the planking on. All the internal decks are in them, just like the real ship. Now, the only complaint that I ever had about the Marple collection is he never left a hole so you could see inside of the thing and see all the work that's inside. And when I was asked to play Ed Marple at our Living Art Show, I actually brought in some of my stuff that's hanging up on the wall over there. and it shows you exactly how the ship is built. Now, we'll be getting into that in a few minutes. Now, every one of these models here, as I said, has got a 5'6" man on it. This one here is the Endeavour, and that was Captain Cook's ship that he actually sailed to the South Pacific, and it ended up getting hooked up on a couple of sandbars and so on and so forth. And so there's a lot of history involved in that particular ship. This one here is a absolutely gorgeous model, and he not only did the actual ship, he also did all of his own wood carving. And the wood carving on the front of this model here, the figurehead, is absolutely unbelievable. There is so much detail. So, now this particular ship here, it took him, now most modelers have 4 or 5 projects all going at the same time. That's like I have. And I usually can't tell you how many hours I spend, but I can usually tell you when I start one and when I finish it. The total elapsed time on this particular model was 5 years. Now, this model here is a model that he never completed, that's sitting here on his table, and his also the riverboat that's over there. His wife wanted a ship model she could use as a coffee table, and that is a coffee table. It is setting up on that gray platform just so it's easier to look at. And if you look at the corners of the top of that plexiglass there, it has little cushions on it because in his house he had a large oval top that used to sit on top of that because it is a coffee table. Now, when a modeler builds things, he has to use all kinds of miniature tools. This is a miniature table saw. He also did a lot of work with his drills from his previous occupation, and that's a milling machine over there, and so on and so forth. I brought in some of my models and some of my work to be able to show the people how the real ship was built. Now, this is one of my models, and you can see that it has all the little frames put in there. Now, those are not bent pieces of wood. What you do is you make a horseshoe, and then once you have the horseshoe built, it is built in 2 layers. And because anywhere there's a glued joint on the other layer, there's a solid piece going across, so you don't have any weak spots. Then once you have all your horseshoes made, then you cut your frame out of that. And that's what that is. And this is the way these things are built. They're all 2 layers thick. Now, once you have all the outside completed, then what you do is you turn it over and you put all your internal decks down inside of it, just like the real ship. And these cannons here, they are turned on a duplicator, and this is my duplicator because this was Markle's duplicator, but we couldn't find it. So I brought mine in to be able to show the people what a duplicator is. It's like a key making machine. The pattern is down here, and this part here rubs up against the pattern, and this part here goes in and cuts the cannon. And that's how that works. These are our bone models, and well, they're called prisoner of war ship models. And they were built when Napoleon Bonaparte was fighting England. And the English captured all these French and American sailors that were fighting on the British side, or the French side, and they threw them in prison. Well, they ran out of prisons, and so what they did is they took old derelict ships, they stripped the masts off of them, they turned them into prison ships, and they anchored them all over England. And this map over here has a bunch of little blue dots on it. That's where all the prison ships were located. Now, the war lasted probably about 10, 15 years. So the prisoners were held prisoners for a long time. And they wanted to make things that they could sell so they could buy extra food and tobacco and that type of thing. So the sailors were working from memory, and they started building ship models out of the bones out of their food. And all the lines and everything were made out of human hair. Now, in the past there was some question as to whether human hair would last that long because there was so much protein that it would break down and so on and so forth. And then somebody pointed out the fact that a mummy was found in Egypt that was over 3,000 years old that still had hair on it. So that sort of solved that problem. Now, supposedly in this museum, now I'm quoting from people have told me this, that we have the second largest collection of prisoner of war ship models on display in the United States. It's second only to the U.S. Naval Academy at Annapolis. Now we had one of the experts from Annapolis come out here some years ago, and he actually started examining some of ours, and he was really fantastic. He thought they were really fantastic. Now, something that he did tell me at that time, though, that I was unaware of, is that these are, he looked down inside and he showed me the wooden hull that's inside of these things. And that's the way these are made. This is not a solid chunk of bone. What they do is they take a wooden block and they carve a hull. And then they take the bone and they make it into strips. And then they nail it onto the wooden block that's inside of there. So all of these have a wooden block inside of them. I mean, you can't see it from here, but they're in there. And some of them are made out of wood, some of them are made out of bone, and some of them are made out of ivory, like this little tiny one here is made out of ivory. And so these are our prisoner of war ship models, and supposedly the lines are made out of human. Now this particular model here is made out of whalebone, and all the black that you see on it is made out of baleen, and the baleen comes out of the whale's mouth. It's a filtering material that some of the whales have. Instead of teeth, they have what they call baleens in there, and it's a fibrous material that they filter all the seawater through to get the plankton and the small shrimp. That cannon barrel there was found in a farmer's field just on the other side of the freeway. It's a place called El Rio. And we borrowed it some years ago from another museum, and we had it for our show, and it did not have a cannon carriage. We had it sitting on a wooden block. And after the show was over, we called them up and we told them we were going to bring it back. And they said, well, we have 6 of them, and if you can use it, just hang on to it. So we washed it out, and when we washed it out, a bunch of really super old U.S. Army buttons came out of it. And we don't know exactly what they were or anything, but it did say U.S. on them, and so on and so forth. Now, those were put in a plastic bag, and since then, the plastic bag has been lost someplace. But before we brought it into our museum as a permanent fixture. We washed it out, and I built the cannon carriage for it, and we put it on the cannon carriage, and we had it at our old museum over on the other side of the harbor. And when we came over here and things got a little bit better, we actually came up with this painting on the wall, or on the window here. And I always tell the people that have little kids, if they want an interesting picture, stand behind the cannon and then have their little kids stand here and point at the cannonball, and you can get an interesting picture. That particular cannon, the barrel itself weighs 625 pounds. And if you're interested how we got it onto the cannon carriage, we picked it up with an engine lift and set it on here. So, okay, these are called Admiralty models or Dockyard models. Now, some time ago, a gentleman was in here, and he came up to me, and I thought he was kidding me. And he asked me, he says, "How do you keep the water out? There's no planking on the bottom." I said, "Well, you just have to sail fast." And then suddenly it dawned on me, he was asking a legitimate question. Now, when you're watching TV and you're watching a movie about the 400s, 500s, 600 time frame, and over in Europe, and some big dignitary is going to go someplace. Well, he brings this wagon up in front of his house with it pulled by an oxen or a horse or something. And he puts his family in there, his servants. There's always a religious guy. So you think, oh man, they must have been really religious. Well, that's partially true. But the main reason for the religious guy, he knew how to read and write. Most of the big dignitaries, a lot of them didn't spend the time to learn, and a lot of them still didn't know how to do it very well. So the religious guy, he acted as a secretary and wrote things and that type of thing. Now, moving forward, when a designer would design up a ship, it didn't do him any good to lay the plans out in front of the Admiralty, because these big dignitaries, they become admirals, not necessarily because they were great sea captains, it's because they had the correct last name. And so they couldn't read these information on the plans, so instead of doing that, the designer would go to the shipyards that was going to build the real ship. He'd have this miniature built, and they'd purposely leave the planking off so the admirals could look down inside and see if their cabin was big enough or whatever. Now, once they decided they wanted 3, 4, 5 of these things, that model went back to the place that was going to build the real ship. And if there was something on the plans that the ship model or the ship people couldn't understand, however this model got built, that's the way the real ship got built. So these things had to really be accurate. And that's the reason they're called dockyard models or shipyard. Okay, this is the USS Constitution. Now, a lot of people don't know this, but this is the oldest active warship in the United States Navy today. Not 10 years ago, 20 years ago, but today. And it's in Boston Harbor. It's open to the public. You can go aboard, learn all about its history and so on and so forth. Its main battle was during the War of 1812. A British ship pulled up alongside of it, fired cannonballs at it, and the cannonballs bounced off. And so that's where it picked up its name, Old Ironside, because the British sailor said it must be made out of iron. Now there's all kinds of stories that go along with the Constitution. But now I saw a History Channel program some time ago, and a gentleman had a large wood carving of Andrew Jackson's head. and he wanted to know where it came from. Well, it turns out that after the War of 1812, Andrew Jackson was a big hero with the battle down in New Orleans with the British and so on and so forth. So when the Constitution went in the yards to have it repaired, they took the figurehead off of the front of this ship because it needed repair, and they carved a figure of Andrew Jackson and put it on there. Now, after the thing was repaired, they put it back out in the harbor, where there was a bunch of people in Boston that didn't like him, and they went and sawed his head off. And so that's where the head of Andrew Jackson comes from. So there's all kinds of stories that go along with this. Now, another thing is this ship was one of the fastest ships in the water at the time, and the British or the French. The French were trying to find out why it was so fast, and so its sister ship came up for sale because we were out of money, and its sister ship was called the Constellation. And the French came in and they purchased it, and they took it to France. They took it apart. They come to find out that the reason it was so fast is because when your ship is under sail and the wind is blowing on the different sails, that force goes down into the keel, and the keel does this because it doesn't have even amount of force on every one, because every mast has a different amount of sails on it. So the mast or the keel has a tendency to do one of these things. And so to stiffen the keel up, the designer of this ship put a runner from the stern on one side all the way down through the keel and comes up into the bow on the opposite side. So they have a big X built into the keel, and it stiffens it up. And the keel doesn't do one of these things. All the water flows evenly across the thing, and that's the reason it was so fast. Okay, now this ship here is the Halifax. Now, it is a colonial schooner. Now, I'm not talking about this ship. I am talking about a colonial schooner that was named the Hannah. And if you're on computer, you can type in Hannah and so on and so forth, learn all about Hannah. Hannah was considered the first ship in the United States Navy. And it looked very similar to this, except for the flag. Now, George Washington was given the assignment to go fight the British, but his troops needed supplies. They needed food, clothing, and so on and so forth. So he went down to the local fishing village. He purchased 3 colonial schooners. And as I said, the first name was called the Hannah. Now, he got his 3 sea caps together, and this ship here is armed with 4 cannons. There's 2 on this side, there's 2 on the other side. He got his 3 sea captains together and he says, okay guys, we're going to go fight the British. And they said, George, you're crazy, you're up a tree. And the British got 200 warships and we only got 3? And he says, no, I don't want you to do that. He said, I don't want you to capture their warships. I want you to go capture unarmed British cargo ships. Bring them back, let me have all the stuff. Then you can sell the ships and make money for yourselves. And so that's what they did, and they were very, very successful. Now, the individual colonies heard what George did. They said, well, you know, he's got a good idea, but he's not playing the game right. So they went to their very wealthy people, convinced them to buy ships, put cannons on them. They licensed them as privateers. Now, there's a real famous guy in our history books, known as a politician, a scientist, all kinds of marvelous stuff. Good old Ben Franklin, he owned 3 privateers. And the first one, or the most famous one, was called the Black Prince. And if you want to learn more about that, you can type that into your computer and learn about Ben Franklin with his privateers. Now this ship here is more of a classic example of what a privateer would look like. And as you notice, it does have the American flag on it, although it's called the Oliver Cromwell. But the privateers were usually more heavily armed than George Washington's original ship. Now in our national anthem, we always talk about rockets, red glare, bombs bursting in air, because that, when Francis Scott Key wrote his poem, that's what he saw. And the rockets, red glare have to do with rockets firing up into the air, but the bomb vessels, that's what this one here is, it's called a bomb vessel. They had mortars on deck, and the mortar shell was a hollow cast iron shell that they put powder inside of it, and they put a time fuser on it. And they would fire it, and when they fought Fort McHenry, they had these anchored, and they took some of the rigging down so that they could swing the cannon around the mortar. And if you look down on deck, you'll see the two mortars there. And the cannon barrel, or the cannon, would fire the mortar shell up over the fort, and then it was timed so it would explode up there, and the shrapnel would come down and kill the people. But we have two bomb vessels here, and that's how they were. This is the turtle ship, and the ship itself, this model, is not made exactly correct. The spikes were never that long. In reality, the spikes were only about 1 inch. Okay? Now, another thing wrong with the way this thing is built, this large timber that runs under here, there's a second one underneath it. And in between those two used to all be open. And that's where the archers stood, and they fired arrows out of this thing also. Now, this is the 1500s, and the cannons they had in here were really not that dependable. So, anyway, they did have the cannons, they did have the archers, but its main armament was in the head of the dragon. They had a large round vessel, and they poured flammable liquid into it, and they pumped air into it, and it shot out a little valve over an open flame and set fire to the enemy ships. And that was the main armament of the turtle ship. Now, the picture we have down here of the admiral, now I understand that the admiral is about as famous in Korea as George Washington is here. And so they were fighting the Japanese at the time, and that picture right there gives you an idea of the size of the spikes. They were really very small. Now here is a smaller model of the turtle boat, and as you see, they have sails, although I was told that this was not a sail, this was a warning flag, and I was told it was ancient Japanese. Well, I was corrected. I had a professor from Hong Kong in here. He says there is no such thing as ancient Japanese, that is ancient Chinese. And he does agree, though, that the sign back here on the black flag says turtle. And that, he claims, is the same symbol used by the Japanese, the Chinese, and even into the Philippine Islands. So, that is my story. This is a Chinese admiral, and the Manikin really doesn't do him justice. He was somewhere between 7 and 8 feet tall. And he was brought to China as a young child from Mongolia. And he became a very fierce and huge warrior, and ended up on the palace guard of the emperor during the Ming Dynasty, which we were talking about, 1400s. And when the Emperor of the Ming Dynasty wanted to do something for the ordinary people, so he decided that he was going to put this guy in charge of a treasure fleet to sail all over the world and bring things back to China that would improve the life of the Chinese people, like fruit seeds and vegetable seeds, and also animals that they could eat, and also for transportation and stuff, things that they did not have in China. And so that's what he did. Now, his name, I pronounce it Zhen He. Here it is right here. That's not the way the Chinese pronounce it at all, though. So, anyway, this is the kind of ship that he actually was given. And it is built at exactly the same scale that that one is, and that one is, and that one is Columbus's largest ship, the Santa Maria. This one here is an English tea clipper called the Cutty Sark, which is still in existence today in England. Now these ships here, they ranged up to 480 feet long. They were monstrous ships for their time. And this map here shows you some of the trips that Zhen He took, and he brought stuff back to China. Now, we do have proof that the Chinese were also along the California coast many, many, many years, about the same time that he was doing these trips. And the reason we say that is because we have giant anchors that they used. And what they did is they took great big stones, bored a hole so that they could run a piece of line down through it, and they tied it to their ship, and that's what they used for their anchors. And there is proof that they actually came ashore. In fact, one place I read about is they said that the admiral that was in charge marched his soldiers inland until they came to a very deep canyon with a river running along the bottom, and we assume it might have been the Grand Canyon. And major things took place to boats during the Civil War that affected navies throughout the entire world. First off, we were going from wooden ships to ironclad, wooden ships, ironclad. We were going from sail power to steam power. The first rotating turret was on the Monitor. Now, when I went to school, they always talked about the Monitor and the Merrimack having the big battle. Well, that is incorrect. The Monitor, yes. The Merrimack, no. The Merrimack was a northern sailing ship, and it was a warship, and it was in the Virginia shipyards being repaired when the war started. Now the Southerners, or the northern sailors, did not want the Southerners to have another warship, so they set fire to it and they sunk it. So when the Southerners came in, they raised this hulk out of the water. They stripped all the burn off of it, and they turned it into an ironclad and renamed it the Virginia. So the two ships that actually fought each other was the USS Monitor and the CSS Virginia. Now the Monitor had the first rotating turret of any ship in the world. Now a lot of ships had rotating cannons, but they were not enclosed in a turret. So it had the first turret. Another thing is the first submarine to sink an enemy vessel was this little guy right down here. And so now it did not have an engine in it. And it had a long bar that was bent down like this. And the sailors sat there and moved it with their hands. And they were the actual motor for this little submarine. Now the submarine here, it was called the Huntley, and it had a big ram coming out, and it had a explosive barrel at the end and a spike. And what the sailors did is they got pumping real fast, and they rammed that into the bottom of a wooden ship. Then they backed off, and then they set the timer on the barrel of explosives, and it blew a big hole in the bottom, and the ship actually sank. So it was the first submarine anywhere to sink an enemy vessel.